Mochi Health is here to help you start your weight loss journey with caring, personalized support. Meet one-on-one with board-certified obesity doctors and registered dietitians who truly listen and understand your unique needs. Eligible patients can access affordable GLP-1 medications delivered right to their door each month. No insurance? No problem. Mochi Health accepts FSA and HSA, making care accessible and affordable. And with 24/7 customer service, you'll never feel alone on your path to better health. Get started with Mochi Health today. Take the free quiz at joinmochi.com and use code AUDIO40 at checkout for $40 off your first month of membership. That's joinmochi.com with promo code AUDIO40.
I'm Alice.
And I'm Brett.
And this is the Prosecutor's Legal Briefs. Welcome back to the Prosecutor's Legal Briefs. I'm your host, Alice, and I'm joined as always by my deferential co-host, Brett.
Hello, Alice. I defer to you always.
You never defer to me.
Only
but
when you're
what? You are
ambiguous.
the only when I'm ambiguous, but you know what? You're the expert of you. So there you go. Look, we just explained Chevron deference to you guys in 3 quips back and forth. I think we're done for the night. That's all I got to say.
Exactly. It's been good. See you guys next week.
Now, those of you thinking, Chevron, isn't that like triangle pattern that you have on like kids' clothes or tablecloths? That's a type of chevron. There you go. But that's not the chevron we're talking about today. And why? Why are we talking about Chevron deference? First of all, you've probably heard about it. You may not know what it is. Why everyone's talking about it all of a sudden, what it has to do with the Supreme Court if it's been around apparently for decades, and what this means literally for your life at home when you're like, seriously, what is Chevron? What is deference? What are y'all talking about? Hopefully we'll break it down today.
Hopefully. I mean, Chevron is probably the most important Supreme Court case that you've never heard of. I mean, maybe you've heard of it, but there's a good chance that you have not. And yet it forms the basis of so much of how our country works, how decisions are made, decisions that affect you in every possible way. But basically, when you think about government, you might think about regulations. So, for instance, this always bothered me during the COVID period. It bothers me really all the time. Whenever you get on an airplane and they say something like, federal law requires you to wear a mask, or federal law requires you not to smoke, or some of that. It's not true. It's not federal law. It's federal regulations. Regulations promulgated by an executive agency, which is interpreting the statute of Congress that gives them authority to regulate. And those regulations become binding on all Americans. The regulations aren't debated by Congress. They're not voted on by anyone you elect. The president doesn't sign off on them, nothing, because there's this entire, what we call the administrative state, that works to sort of give effect. This is the most charitable interpretation, to give effect to the laws that Congress does pass, many of which are very old. As you know, Congress doesn't do much these days except throw, feces at each other. But back a long time ago, like 40, 50 years, 90 years ago, they did pass statutes, and a lot of them were pretty complicated. And they created these federal agencies, many of which exist to this day and are often regulating about everything that's going on. Well, where does the power to do that come from? Why do those regulations have effect? If you're in law school, those of you in law school, you may take administrative law. It's a great class. We're going to teach you some form of administrative law here over the next hour or so. So the kind of thing that you would learn in an hour and a half, 3-hour class a week for an entire year. We're going to try and do that. So just know, this is going to be very high level, very generalized. Chevron is incredibly complicated, but it's really important right now because it's back in front of the Supreme Court. And so we wanted to tell you a little bit about it.
So when you hear Chevron deference, you're thinking, literally, what is that? Is that a book? Is that, a new dance on TikTok? No, it is a legal doctrine that comes from the case Chevron versus National Resource Defense Council from the Supreme Court in 1983. So you'll hear this often just referred to as Chevron. And the principle that I'm going to tell you about that came out of this case, Chevron versus the NRDC, is now referred to as Chevron deference. So in that case, the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, required a permit to build a stationary source. Love the EPA. The EPA has all these words in everything, all their statutes, like waterway. Waterway apparently is incredibly ambiguous and like what different fish live in and everything. Anyways, if you have an interest in like environmental law and the EPA and all these different words, I didn't know there was so much ambiguity in the way we describe all the different environmental things in our life. So, stationary source. That sounds simple enough, right? That makes sense. A lot of things in your life require permits before you build them. Before you build a house or an addition to your house, you require a building permit. Before you do X, Y, and Z, you usually have to get some sort of license. This makes sense. All right. So the EPA said that if you had one pollution source, that was a stationary source. So they're defining what a stationary source is. But they also allowed for something called the bubble concept, where one plant could build several pollution-emitting devices, but count them as one stationary source. Are your heads spinning yet? So, as you can see, the EPA is giving definition to basically when you need a permit and what falls into that definition. So there's lots of different levels here, and there is some confusion here. So the NRDC sues, claiming that EPA was wrong in defining a stationary source, a term that Congress did not define. And so this whole question is, can the EPA define stationary source? And if it can, why can it? And what force of law does it have, if any?
So this goes to the D.C. Circuit. And the D.C. Circuit says, we're going to set aside this regulation. Now, this was in a case called NRDC versus Gorsuch. Yes, that Gorsuch. This is actually Justice Gorsuch's mother, who was the administrator of the EPA at the time. And the court concluded that because they looked at the purpose of the statute, they said, what is the purpose of the Clean Air Act? And they decided, well, it's to produce clean air. And so they decided that the way to interpret stationary source would be whatever made the air cleanest. So this EPA interpretation of stationary source would not make the air cleanest, because instead of each pollution emitting device being a stationary source and requiring a permit, they're allowing you to group them together and get one permit. That seems to be contrary to the purpose of the statute. So therefore, we in the DC Circuit, we're going to say, no, that's not right. Can't do that. Go back, do another regulation, and do it the way we think you should.
Just based on that interpretation of how you get deference, if the purpose of the Clean Air Act was to produce clean air, you would think that the only time you could ever defer to the EPA in that reasoning would be like zero emissions at all times. Right?
That's a good point.
This has nothing to do with Chevron deference. It's just, we're nerds. This is what we do, is pick apart legal opinions. Well, don't you worry. It doesn't stay at the DC Circuit long, because if you're looking at our judicial system, we have the district court. If we're talking about the federal system, the district court, a federal appellate court, which in this case is the DC Circuit. And then what's above that? You guessed it, the United States Supreme Court. And we've talked about how not every case that requests the Supreme Court to take a look at it, requesting cert, actually gets granted, right? Thousands and thousands of cases request cert every year, and it's changed over the decades, but something like between 70 to 80 cases actually are granted cert each year. And this case was decided to be taken up by the Supreme Court. Now, as you may know, in our U.S. system, there are 9 justices who sit on the Supreme Court, but only 6 justices sat in on this particular question. 3 justices took no part in the case. 2 of them for illness reasons, and one for financial interests. In other words, only one justice recused because of a conflict or a potential appearance of conflict. The other two were apparently just sick. You know, nowadays, I can't remember the last time, was it Justice Ginsburg? One of the justices who had kind of a bout of hospital stays in the last 5 years, I think may have sat out one opinion, but this doesn't happen often now because they just wait to release the opinion.
And it's not like oral argument matters anyway. So, right. You know, they just read the briefs. But yeah, it's interesting.
And anyways, just so you know, it's not that 3 justices recused themselves. Really, 1 recused themselves. The other 2 were, I don't know, had the black lung pop on the day of oral argument.
Rehnquist and Thurgood Marshall were sick, and Sandra Day O'Connor, I guess, owns some stock in Chevron or something.
So now down to 6 justices to decide this case. And they were completely unanimous. All 6 justices who heard the case voted that the D.C. Circuit got it wrong. The court proposed instead a 2-step process.
And this was a long time coming because the D.C. Circuit had sort of developed this reputation as the sort of know-it-all circuit who was constantly telling administrative agencies exactly what to do. So it was a matter of time, I think, before someone did something. And so now the court steps in and says, look, we're not going to let you be the ones to decide what the EPA should be doing or shouldn't be doing. And this 2-step process began with the first step, which seems like it should be pretty obvious. If Congress is clear in what it wants and what it expects the agency to do, that's the end of it. Congress controls. They're the ones who passed the statute. The president signed it. It is now law. That's the way it's supposed to be. But what if, as in this case, there is an ambiguity? Who decides then? Who decides when there's a legitimate question about what a provision of a statute means? The agency, the court decided. So the court said, look, you know, in so many other circumstances, this is exactly what we'd expect courts to do. There's an ambiguity in the law. Courts interpret the law. They're the ones who should be deciding the ambiguity. But in these cases, when it's a statute that is overseen by an administrative agency who is issuing regulations in keeping with the statute, we're going to say that the courts owe deference to that interpretation. And this deference means, unless it's clearly wrong, the court should defer to the agency interpretation. Part of the reasoning for this was a common sense thing. The agencies have expertise. The EPA works in this area all the time. They have all these career people who this is all they do is environmental stuff. So they should have a better understanding of what a stationary source is than some judge who's been sitting on the DC Circuit for 20 years. And that's something, that expertise, by the way, that not only does the court not have, but even Congress doesn't necessarily have.
So this is interesting. For those of you who may not know how our administrative state works here in the United States, federal agencies are staffed in majority by civil servants, meaning people who do not turn over from political administration to political administration. Of course, kind of the cabinet members, the secretary, the heads of those agencies may be politically appointed, but they're a very small subset of who actually works in the agency. Take the EPA, for example. The administrator of the EPA serves at the pleasure of the president, but there are thousands, I don't think that's an exaggeration, maybe more than thousands of employees who work at the EPA who are all civil servants. So they keep their job even when the next president takes over and the next president takes over. And this is important to note because the civil servants are not politically held accountable. They're not elected. If you have civil servant protections, that's actually really difficult to fire you. And also, the heads of the agencies, if those heads of agencies every agency is slightly different, but let's take the EPA, for example. They're appointed by the president. The president's elected, but the head of that agency is not elected. So other than serving at the pleasure of the president, doesn't really have political accountability. This matters for kind of the arguments that are going to come up later as to why perhaps there may be some problems with Chevron deference. So that's not the only reason that the court concluded courts should give deference to the interpretation of the statute by the agency. The other reason was political. They said, quote, when a challenge to an agency construction of a statutory provision fairly conceptualized really centers on the wisdom of the agency's policy, rather than whether it is a reasonable choice within a gap left open by Congress, the challenge must fail. In such a case, federal judges who have no constituency have a duty to respect legitimate policy choices made by those who do. The responsibilities for assessing the wisdom of such policy choices and resolving the struggle between competing views of the public interest are not judicial ones. Our Constitution vests such responsibilities in the political branches. That's really interesting, because that sounds like the opposite of what I just said about political accountability. Here you hear the courts kind of using the same reasoning I just was talking about. They're saying, us as the federal judiciary, they serve for lifetime. Once you're appointed, you serve forever until you retire. And they're saying because we're not politically accountable, those decisions of interpretation shouldn't fall to us. They should fall to political branches. So the consequence was, and by the way, the political branches here would be just the executive branch, not Congress, not the legislature, which is also a political branch because your congressmen and your senators are all elected. So is the president, but the president is the head of the executive branch, which obviously has many other parts to it. We've talked about this in one of our other legal briefs about Trump oral argument. Whether you believe in the unitary executive or not, there is one person that you vote for within the executive branch, whereas you vote for every member of the legislature.
Yeah, and you really have to understand the world that the Supreme Court was operating in when they issued this decision. So this is 1983. There has been a lot of criticism for the last 20 or so years about activist judges and an activist judiciary, and judges deciding that they should be the ones who really run the country, not the people who are elected. And there was a big push, particularly on the sort of conservative side of the law, to rein in activist judges, to limit the power of judges. And Chevron was a natural growth from that. After it was decided, Justice Scalia, who had either been appointed by this point or was just about to be confirmed, I can't remember exactly when he came on the bench, he really took this and ran with it and built the Chevron system that we know today, the two-step system. It was in Chevron, but Chevron didn't flesh it out that much, but it was fleshed out very much so over the next few years. And the idea was this, that it's not going to be unelected judges making these decisions anymore. It's going to be elected officials. And mostly it was the president, but there was some expectation that really didn't work out at all, that Congress would also legislate with this background, that Congress would still be legislating and still making deliberate choices, but it would occasionally leave open things that it wanted the administrative branch to do. That is not really how it worked out. How it worked out instead was you had a lot of hesitance on the part of Congress to really tackle with difficult issues, instead relying on the executive branch and the administrative agencies to deal with really difficult questions. So rather than, for instance, tackling a question about, say, the climate change, rather than tackling that in the legislative branch, instead, you just defer to the EPA, you defer to the various agencies, you let them do it, and then you never have to take the hit on it. You can just sort of say, you can rail against those evil administrative agencies, but you didn't have to vote on anything. Nobody can blame you for anything that happened. And so Congress, in a lot of ways, since this happened, has become more and more reticent to actually do anything about weighty issues when it can be handled by the administrative agencies, particularly when your party is in power, when you have the presidency. Because when you have the presidency, you can count on those administrative agencies to essentially do what you want them to do, rather than something else. President Obama had a famous thing that he said in his second term. He was pushing Congress to pass some legislation. I can't remember exactly what it was about, but he wanted Congress to pass this piece of legislation. And he sort of warned Congress. He said, look, you'll either pass it or I've got a pen and I've got a phone and I'll do it myself. And the point he was making there was, we will do it through administrative action if you don't legislate on this.
So what's the consequence of this decision by the Supreme Court? You got it. It becomes the rise of the administrative state. And because these administrative agencies have basically been told, if there's an ambiguous term, you get to define it. In fact, it's your duty to define it. And we as courts are going to defer to you. If you've ever read a statute, it is a matter of interpretation, but just about any sentence you read in anything in life, someone can probably find something about it that is ambiguous. And when you have, therefore, agencies, lots of different agencies, perhaps who may disagree with you politically and then change with each administration, have lots of different regulations and interpretations of what the statutes say, those interpretations will likely affect someone in the world negatively, right? Someone is going to want the statute to read something else. And so what do you do when you don't like how a law or a regulation applies to you? The good old American way. You sue. So there's been an incredible rise of litigation on Chevron deference issues, the administrative state. Oftentimes, actually, you'll say there's a challenge to the law. Honestly, most of this litigation is actually challenged to the regulation, not to the law. And so we've come across many, many cases over the last, basically 4 decades. The Clean Power Plan, the Endangered Species Act, the Waters of the United States. I mean, basically every administrative action is challenged at some point. They don't all make it to the Supreme Court. But through this litigation, we've really kind of fleshed out what Chevron deference looks like. So why are we talking about it today if this has been something that's developed and accepted by the administrative state and by the courts for nearly 4 decades?
And we're talking about it today because they may be about to get rid of it. But before we get to that, so we're talking about the consequences, and it's so interesting the way this went. So one thing that happened was, so an agency issues a regulation. What if the regulation is vague? What if it's ambiguous? What do you do then?
It happens all the time, y'all.
Then you have Seminole Rock in our deference, which says that when an agency interprets its own ambiguous regulations, you defer to the agency. So you sort of have double deference
upon deference. Double deference. You can't make this stuff up.
And just imagine,
well, you can.
And we're talking about how this all turns into litigation. So, think about like your favorite movie about political activity. The evil legislature, or the state, the mayor in not Dirty Dancing, the other dancing movie, Footloose. In Footloose, the town bans dancing in the city, and all the kids, they rally together to change the town's mind. So they'll repeal that and allow them to dance again. Well, if the town was operating under Chevron deference, then the town dancing agency would have issued a regulation saying, you can't dance if there's more than one person in the dance hall. They put a cap on how many people can dance at the dance hall, which effectively gets rid of dancing. But there's no rule, there's no law that makes dancing illegal. And then you can't really go to the town council because they didn't pass the rule. You just have to sue. And then you have to fight it out in the courts. And that's what happened. The political accountability went away. There became less and less sort of lobbying Congress to do or not do something, and more of this was all fought out in the courts, which means the judicial nomination process became even more political, because having people in those positions who would interpret what the agencies were doing and whether or not it fit Chevron deference became important. So this initial idea was, we're going to we need judges not to be so active. And instead what happened is, number one, what's the first step of Chevron? Is Congress clear or not? Well, that became a big deal. So are you ever going to find ambiguity? There's one circuit judge, who famously has never gotten past Chevron step 1. He always says it's not ambiguous, and then he rules on it. And just think about how strange that is, because how do you deal with that? He's in one circuit not finding anything ambiguous. Then you got people in other circuits who are finding it ambiguous. And then what does ambiguous mean? There's an ambiguity about what ambiguous means. This actually came up in the Supreme Court argument we're going to talk about how ambiguous is. And when is it ambiguous? And then it's just, it's ambiguous when you want to side with the agency. That used to be the old joke. That decided the case. Whatever you said in step 1 decided the case. If you said it was ambiguous, that meant you were siding with the agency. If you said it wasn't ambiguous, that meant you were going to overturn the agency.
And so you see what ultimately happens. If Brett just said that if you want to decide with the agency, you find whatever you're trying to define ambiguous, then there's always deference to the agency. But for that judge who never finds anything ambiguous, what happens there? Who decides? The judge. Because they're not only saying it's not ambiguous, they're telling you the term is so clear that this is what it means. Therefore, it is the judge defining what that term that an agency said was ambiguous is. And so you see how there's this real problem here. And I'll tell you this. I used to work for the government in this capacity, specifically defending against Chevron deference attacks. And this, I probably shouldn't be telling this, but
don't reveal any client secrets, Alice.
Your good tax dollars at work. Every holiday season, we would put on a talent show. I don't know what it's called. This is so nerdy. We would do like basically a song and dance, making fun of all the cases we had to do that year. And almost all of our cases had to do with Chevron deference. And we had this song we sang every year that essentially was what Brett just said. We would say, basically the song was, I'll figure it out for you. Let's look and see if it's ambiguous. Absolutely ambiguous. We win it all. That's like the entire song, because that's what we argued every time. And that's exactly what you argue as the government. If you're trying to ensure that your agency's interpretation of the regulations or the interpretation of the statute is always going to be deferred to. And this is really interesting. Up until now, whenever we talked about judges, remember how we've always said the Supreme Court is the supreme law of the land. They have the role within the 3 branches of government that is very different from the other 2, because they are the ones who sit back and do not make law. They do not execute the law. Rather, they call balls and strikes, right? That's like a famous line from the confirmation hearing of the Chief Justice, right? I'm just the umpire. I call balls and strikes. I'm not writing the laws. I'm not telling you how to apply the law. I simply tell you, this is ambiguous. This is not ambiguous. How unoffensive could that be? It's supposed to make the judiciary the least powerful branch. But instead, we are now in this kind of brave new world where the judiciary, which should have been the supreme interpretation of the law, defers to not even the executive branch, but an agency within the executive branch. And there are many, many, many agencies. So you see how this is like beginning to kind of turn on its head a bit. And it feels like a situation where the center cannot hold. And
you think about, we're just going to rant here for a little while before we get into it. Whatever you think about this, the fact of the matter is, it doesn't really matter your political position or anything, because whoever's in power uses it. Because there's this other Brand X. So Brand X is a Supreme Court case that said, by the way, if an agency interprets a statute one way, says it's ambiguous and it means X, and then next election, party switches, new agency head comes in, and all of a sudden the agency says, it is ambiguous, but in our expertise, it actually means the opposite of X. Isn't that crazy? And Brand X said, yep, that's the way it works. They get the same deference as the last group of people. You guys may remember we talked about the student loan question. Could the president forgive student loans? And this was sort of one of these cases. So in the Trump administration, the Secretary of Education and the General Counsel of Education looked at the regulation, looked at the statute, and said, under the statute, we can't forgive these student loans for all these reasons. President Biden's elected, new administrator comes in, new general counsel, and wouldn't you know it, when they looked at the exact same language, they came to the exact opposite conclusion. And now all of a sudden they're saying, you can. And so, and it swings like this every 4 to 8 years, 12 years if you're lucky. The last time I think we've had 12 years of one party rule was 1980 to 1992. But usually it's every 4 to 8 years you're having a change in administration, a change in party, and a change in the way they view these rules. So you don't have, when you pass a statute until it gets repealed or a new statute gets passed, that's the statute, and that's what you have reliability on. And so you can do things with the expectation that's the way it's going to be. And I'll tell you a story that relates to this. Unlike Alice, I used to sue over this. So I used to sue Alice to try.
It takes 2 to tango.
Exactly. And I remember there was this one regulation. It was a clean air regulation. And it was very clearly going down. But if it had remained in effect, this power plant was going to have to close. There was no way they could operate the power plant if this regulation was in place. And frankly, that was the point of the regulations. They wanted to close down these various power plants. But it was going to fail. It was going to go away. The industry decided to go ahead and close the plant anyway. And their reasoning was, look, great, we won today, but guess what? In 4 years, somebody else will be in power and it'll switch back. We will have invested all this money in this plant. Better just to close it now because we have no reliance. We can't rely on this because it changes so much. And that was such an interesting insight into how the shaky ground on which everything is built when it's based on these regulations, which can literally change, just completely turn over every time there's an election.
And that's a really interesting externality on the business market, right? Entire industries are changing or completely pulling out of areas of business because it's no longer lucrative to be swinging back and forth and not knowing what's going to happen in the next election. And again, it's not down political lines. It literally means you may not know. You could be on the same political party, but for whatever reason, this new head or the pressures have changed in mainstream society about the particular interpretation will cause the head to change. And there's another externality too. We've talked a lot about that other third branch, the legislature. Before, there may have been pressures from those voting on a bill to say, wait, what am I voting on? I don't even know what this is that we're voting on. We haven't defined this. This is completely inadministrable as a law. These are just like ideas on a page. I'm not going to vote on it until we hash it out. And of course, that process is meant to be slow, right? The reason we have the number of congressmen and senators we have partly is to ensure representation across all the different geographic regions of our country and all the different people who live here. And it's not just one person being a dictator and deciding what the laws are in this country. The idea was it was supposed to be a slow moving morass of a government so that there was forced conversation and compromise to arrive at before you pass a law. But now the lawmakers are okay with things being ambiguous because someone's going to figure it out. They can always say, well, the experts at the agencies will figure it out. So not that they always had the best dialogue and always hashed out all of the issues with each law, but there definitely is. I mean, think about the incentives, right? If no one is checking your homework, you might not be as careful about it because the buck doesn't stop with you. And so if the buck isn't stopping with the people who pass the laws, there kind of begets additional ambiguity. Well, if it's ambiguous, they'll just interpret it. Let's vote on this. It's close enough to what I kind of want anyways. So it's almost like this has begotten even more ambiguous statutes.
And Alice is absolutely right about this. I've been in the room when this happened. When I worked for the Senate, there was a piece of legislation, and I remember it was my boss and a member of the other party, and the two legislative staffs got together because it's not like the people who are elected actually do any of this to figure out what the statute was going to say. And I was in there for some reason. I can't remember why because it didn't really involve me, but they took me, and so I got to watch. And literally they were hammering out this particular piece of language, and they reached a point where they kind of got it ambiguous enough that both of them could agree on it. So, it didn't go as far as we wanted it to go, but it didn't go so far that it would upset the other side. And it was ambiguous enough that really, it just really kind of depends on who's interpreting it, which way it's going to go. And everybody was fine with that. They're like, okay, sounds good to us. And that was the language.
And here's why it's okay. Some of you may be thinking, well, but then if it's ambiguous and maybe the agency is going to interpret it opposite than what that particular legislature wants, how does their goal get met? It doesn't matter. All politicians, congressmen, and senators really want is to be able to point to some win that they voted on in terms of the law for their next campaign, and they can easily blame the agency of another political party. They can say, I passed this law because I cared about the clean air, and we were going to get clean air, and look at the strong statute I passed for all you people of Scandinavia. Just kidding. Scandinavia is not in the United States. But look what this terrible agency under this president that I'm opposed to did. Interpreted the exact opposite way I intended it to work for all of you. Vote for me because I care about clean air. It doesn't really matter. Ambiguity actually works in their favor because they can claim the law as their own if their constituents are happy, and they can push it away and blame the agency if it is interpreted in a way that their constituents don't like. You see how it's like really taking away political accountability, which was what the Supreme Court wanted in the first place, was political accountability from the lawmakers themselves.
And so just some examples that right now. So cryptocurrency. Cryptocurrency is like a new Wild West thing, right? You would expect, given how big it's been, now you have some really large cryptocurrencies. They are now traded in ETFs. I mean, they're huge. They're starting to do things like collapse, costing people billions of dollars. People are, using them to commit all kinds of frauds. The kind of thing that you would expect. This seems like we need some legislation. Well, there hasn't been any legislation. There have been regulations, though. And what are those regulations based on? Are they based on a law that has been passed in the last, this millennia? No, they're based on laws passed in the 1930s. Laws passed to govern securities, stocks, back when they still traded stocks on ticker tape. Those laws are being used to justify regulations that regulate cryptocurrency, rather than having Congress step in and actually do its job and figure something out in a way to regulate these, or even, pass a law giving power to an agency to do it. They don't even do that anymore. They don't even go so far as to set up the agencies, barring some sort of massive scandal. You've had a couple massive scandals in the last 20 years, which have produced new regulations, new agencies, but usually you just don't even see it.
Let me point out something that may not be clear, because a lot of people are saying, okay, fine, our legislatures are a mess. They're not going to pass anything anyway. So even if we took away this whole Chevron deference thing, it's not like it's going to force the legislatures to be better legislatures. And anyways, we have the experts in the agency. So let me just defer to experts, because Senator X, Y, and Z from, whatever state is not going to be an expert on clean water. So I actually am going to defer to the clean water expert within the agency. Expert is a word used to describe who is interpreting these. But just so you know, we've talked about experts in the sense of an expert being qualified to testify as an expert on a particular subject in court, and you can challenge their expertise through a Daubert motion, or as Brett really likes to call it, the Daubert motion. We're not using the same definition of expert here. While there's a legal standard or legal element you have to meet to qualify as an expert to testify in a case, experts here is really used in a colloquial term. It is a person who works at the agency. They may or may not have expertise in what you may define as expertise. There is no checklist of what you have to have before you can be the one to interpret a statute. So it's not like everyone who works at these agencies has a PhD in that particular area. It's very possible, there really may be some actual experts in a particular area, but think of all the laws that are passed. It's impossible to have an expert, and the government doesn't go out and hire an expert on X, Y, or Z whenever they're like, well, this statute looks real ambiguous. Let's go get us an expert. We're going to vet through all the resumes and make sure 1, 2, and 3 are checked off. No, lots of statutes are passed. A lot of them need to be interpreted by the agency, and there are usually just people who work there who may have worked in that area for a long time and have familiarity with the area of law, but there is no checklist or standard you have to meet to qualify as an expert who is allowed to define these ambiguous terms.
And look, the one that I love is all the politicians are corrupt. We need the good, honest, career people at the agencies, as if the people at the agencies are somehow immune from having any effect outside of just wanting to do whatever the best thing is for America. I mean, if you guys have ever been to DC, agency capture is a real thing. If you work in DC, you can go to a different boondoggle every single day. It's sponsored by somebody different. One of the best ones is Canada boondoggles. They're great. If you're up in DC and you can ever get over to the Canadian Embassy for a boondoggle, fantastic. But you get these industry groups come in, state groups will come in, the Maine people, man, the lobster you get from the Maine people, Great. And we have all these rules to make sure it's ethical. So, for instance, they don't give you a fork and a knife because that would be a meal. So instead, they serve the lobster on a toothpick because then it's fine, right? So this notion that, well, it's okay. We'd much rather have the good, honest civil servants doing it than the politicians. No, that is not going to protect you from corruption or anything along those lines. The other problem is their expertise is often in the actual scientific stuff. Sometimes the statute is ambiguous in a way, or is delegated. Delegation's a different thing, in a way that the experts are in the perfect place to decide it. I'll give you an example. So EPA can regulate the amount of mercury in the water. EPA should regulate the amount of mercury in the water that's a safe level, right? Now, people fight to the death over what that is. But at least you can look to some expertise about how much mercury can be in the water, and it's okay. Obviously, oftentimes, the EPA regulators who do that are accused of capture and being captured by the various industries who want to put mercury in the water. But nevertheless, that's at least something where there could be some scientific evidence. Other stuff, though, is pure law. It's the kind of stuff that you really would rather have Congress, the presidency, and judges deciding. I'll give you an example. Lawsuit I was involved in, the Endangered Species Act. We all love endangered species, right? We don't want any of the endangered species to become extinct species. We want them to at least remain endangered and preferably not be endangered anymore. Well, one of the things that you have to do if you want to save endangered species is you have to protect their habitat. So, you got the manatees swimming around in the water, so you got to protect the water from the manatees. Or, you got some swamps and you got your alligators. We got to protect the alligators. So you have to protect the habitat. And habitat usually is defined as where the animal lives, right? And that makes sense. Well, recently there was an effort by, I forget, Department of Commerce or Department of Interior. I forget who regulates the Endangered Species Act. But they wanted to issue a new definition of habitat. And they wanted it to be not just where an animal lives, but anywhere an animal could possibly ever live. The idea being that we need to not only protect the habitat as it currently exists, but habitat as it potentially might be. And you might think, that sounds good. We need to do that. Well, here was the example they used. So they talked about a butterfly lives at the bottom of a mountain. And it lives in this particular temperate zone at the bottom of the mountain. And then they said, well, look, over the next 100 years, if you have climate change and it occurs at a particular rate, the habitable zone of the butterfly will move up the mountain. And depending on how much climate change you have, the habitable zone could go all the way from the bottom of the mountain to the top of the mountain. Therefore, we can regulate the entire mountain under the Endangered Species Act. And the practical effect of this was there was no land in the United States that was not the habitat for some endangered species. You live in a desert, you never know. One day it could be a lake. And if it's a lake, then it could be habitat for an endangered fish. So therefore, we get to regulate your land usage of this desert on the idea that one day a fish might live there. And that's the kind of thing where you start to see how the creep of the administrative state really starts to affect your political rights and things that you would much rather have the elected branches of government decide.
So, look, the reason we're talking about this is not because in 1986, I wasn't old enough to have any opinions on Chevron. This came out of some malicious, terrible place where, we see this new place where a bunch of power can go, and we're going to start building this doctrine that is going to allow power outside of democracy. No. It came from a really well-meaning place that was trying to ensure there was political accountability. The reason we're telling you all of these reasons is to explain this case that we're about to now talk about and why it's before the Supreme Court, and to show you the logical ends of what's happened over the last 40 years. We've talked about how the administrative state has grown. What we see now did not exist 40 years ago, But when we have legal rulings, the industry, by industry I just mean like the law, right, reacts in kind based on these rulings, and they're reasonable, right? If the agency says, I'm supposed to be the one defining this, well, the Supreme Court just told me to do it, so they did what they thought they were supposed to do. And then when it negatively affected a business, they said, well, we have to sue about this because I think it's actually ambiguous. So then they sued. And back and forth for 40 years, now we have built up this doctrine, and you see kind of what has happened into this snowball effect. So we're not saying that the world we live in now existed 40 years ago. We're explaining basically what happened that flowed from the Chevron case.
And these things are hard. Waters of the United States, impossible. They've been trying to figure out waters of the United States since the Clean Water Act was passed. And you have this notion on the Constitution, the federal government can regulate the waters of the United States, so you can pass laws about things you can do, and you want to keep the water clean. Those of you who live in Cleveland, the famous river caught on fire is like something people always use as an example. We don't want rivers to catch on fire. So you're always trying to figure out, well, what is the water of the United States? Is it like the Mississippi River? Well, that's great, but there's a lot of much smaller rivers and streams and lakes than that you probably need to do something about if you're actually worried about clean water. So then you're like, okay, so it's not just the big ones, maybe a lake, but not a pond. But then you have the problem of runoff. You have the problem of wetlands. You have all these issues. So like the last Waters of the United States rule, which got vacated, there was a provision in it that specifically said that puddles that form in your front lawn when it rains are not waters of the United States. And it's, if you're having to say that, if you're having to specifically carve out puddles, that is probably a problem. That probably speaks to a little bit of too broad an interpretation of this. But this stuff was all happening under Chevron. And what happened is at some point, sort of the center could not hold. We're going to talk about what's about to happen to Chevron, but before anything happened to Chevron, basically the Supreme Court abandoned it and started doing something called the major questions doctrine, which has come up in a couple of our legal briefs before. And essentially what the Supreme Court said was, look, whatever the case may be with your average regulation, these regulations that are going to have these massive effects, we can't just do it this way. It has to be done through Congress. It has to be done through some sort of legislative process. If it's a major question, we're going to look at these regulations in a very different way than we have before. So that has been sort of the middle ground position, or the exception that the courts have carved out to deal with these regulations, which feel like there should be some sort of political accountability to them, not necessarily just agency action. And what you've seen, Chevron doctrine, as we said before, was a reaction to what was considered activist judges. And it was sort of a conservative legal movement thing to create Chevron. Well, I would say, I don't know when it began. I don't know when it turned against Chevron, but now there's very much a large group of judges, lawyers, and scholars who Chevron is the great evil. It's like Chevron delenda est. It must be destroyed. And there's been this march to limit Chevron or eliminate Chevron that's been happening for at least the last 20 years. And it seems like it is coming to a head now in a case called Loper-Bright. There's actually two cases, but Loper-Bright, I like the sound of it better. So the two consolidated cases, Loper-Bright, I think is the one that they'll end up using. And this is probably the case that's going to kill Chevron. And it was brought by herring fishermen, which this is a good example to all you lawyers out there when you're trying to bring a case, a test case, to do something like overturn a statute, or not a statute, a decision that was unanimous, is 40 years old, has been cited tens of thousands of times. You're trying to overturn it. You don't do Chevron 2. You don't call up the oil company and say, hey guys, we're riding again. Everybody get ready. We're going back to court. No, you get a bunch of herring fishermen and you say, hey guys, you ever heard of Chevron deference? No? Well, we think we could help you out, and maybe you can help us out too. And then you do this case. So basically, the Magnuson-Stevens Act, which is another one of those acts that who knows when it was passed, but not recently. It governs fisheries, and it requires fishermen to allow federal observers on boats when these guys go out fishing. And there are provisions in various parts of the law that say the cost of monitoring is what this is. It can't be more than like 3% of the catch for that day. So if you have a monitor and it's going to cost you some money, it can't cost you more than 3%. And that's the way it was, right? But at some point...
Just by the way, the law was passed in 1976. So before Chevron deference.
1976. So at some point, the regulators, they kind of ran out of money. So they didn't have enough money to hire as many monitors as they wanted to hire. And so this question arose. They basically passed a regulation saying, you're going to have to pay for the monitors. You know, the statute doesn't say who has to pay for them, so you're going to have to pay for them. And this cost was actually going to be much higher than that 3% that existed in other parts of the statute. So the fishermen are saying, look, in other parts of the statute, it talks about 3%. So you can't do this because this is going to be like 20% of our entire budget for the year. You know, the statute in other places limits it to 3% for whatever. Well, the problem was Chevron deference. The courts, when they heard this, said, look, it's ambiguous about who has to pay for these monitors. Doesn't say they can't force you to pay them. So you're going to have to pay for these monitors. And this is the ultimate bad facts make bad law, because you would think that any idiot would understand that forcing fishermen to pay the salaries of the federal spies essentially on their boat to ensure that they're conforming to federal law is a really, really, really bad idea. It's the kind of thing that's going to get people upset. But that was the position that the National Marine Fisheries Service took. It's probably the dumbest thing they could possibly do because it set up this perfect challenge to this law. And I'll just go and tell you, whether they overturn Chevron or not, this is going down. You could tell from the arguments, this ain't going to cut it. In fact, it was like the conservative justices want to overturn Chevron. The liberal justices were like, hey, couldn't we just say that they're wrong here? Couldn't we just say that this is, even under step one of Chevron, this is incorrect? And it was kind of funny because the people arguing for Loper Bright, they want to overturn Chevron. So it was kind of funny because on the one hand, you want to win the case. So you kind of just want to say, well, actually, you're right. If we just stopped at step one, that would be fine. We'd win. But obviously, they wanted to take it further than that.
This is where you have like your client and then what you're trying to do in the law as well. And this is, again, kind of the bad facts, or good facts, if you're trying to overturn Chevron. Herring fishermen, right? They're not the first ones that come to mind of like flowing with money as maybe Chevron, like the oil and gas men are. And so here we have quite literally a very sympathetic group with great facts. And those of you listening, just know at oral arguments, it was pretty unanimous across the board. Whatever side of the aisle you think these justices are, who appointed them, they were all like, yeah, this is a pretty bad regulation. This doesn't seem just. This doesn't seem fair. But how do we go about this? Are we going to overturn 40 years of precedents, or are we going to make this fact-bound, fact-specific to just this one case?
And the answer is they're going to overturn Chevron. That is going to happen. I will be shocked if Chevron is not overturned. And the question will be, what is the consequence of that? Chevron, for all its faults, and we've spent a lot of time on its various faults, also created a relatively... It was, in a weird way, stable and reliable.
I'm going to say it was administrable.
It was administrable. That's a great way to put it, Alice.
It's administrable, whether you think it's good or bad. You could actually know what next steps to take. The problem here is we don't actually know what next step to take. Like, what happens if there is ambiguity?
Because you have to do this, right? Like, number one, it is impossible to write a statute that's not ambiguous. We've been knocking Congress this whole time, but it actually is, you couldn't do it. It's not, man, Congress sure doesn't know how to write laws. Even if everyone in Congress, all of them came together in a kumbaya moment and said, we need to address this one issue, and we are all speaking of one voice and how we're going to address it. The actual writing of the laws are really long. They have a lot of text, even if you manage to keep out all the extraneous stuff, which always manages to make itself into it. There will be ambiguities. And there are, in our statutory interpretation episode, we talked about this. Just language, human language, especially when you have to write it down and it has to be applicable and understandable by everyone across the country in all situations, it's always going to produce ambiguity. And unlike any other situation, if I say something and you're confused, I can say, oh, well, that's not what I meant. Let me explain it further. You can't do that in a statute. It's written down, and that's what it is. So somebody's going to have to interpret it. And then, there was a problem that Chevron was meant to address. Who should it be? Do you really want? We've been talking about accountability. Do you really want judges being the ones who are doing this? Do you just want it to depend not necessarily on the administration in office, which you don't like because it's every 4 or 8 years it's changing and then your obligations are changing. But it's going to depend on which judge you get in front of and where it gets filed. Is it filed in a district in Texas or is it filed in a district in Hawaii? And is it going to go up to the 5th Circuit or is it going to go up to the 4th Circuit? Is it going to be in front of the DC Circuit that leans one way or, the 7th Circuit that leans another? And then is it going to go to the Supreme Court? The Supreme Court doesn't take many cases. People just always assume, well, the Supreme Court will fix it. Well, no, they don't take all the cases. So there's going to be a lot of these decisions that are going to be decided by these judges. And then what if it's happening? You have a national regulation that's being interpreted in different states, in different circuits, by different judges in different ways. Jason Blair used the example of the Sabbath. If you had a law about the Sabbath, well, what is the Sabbath? For some people, it's Saturday. For some people, it's Sunday. And so maybe for some people, it's Friday. I don't know if Muslims call Friday Sabbath or not, but it could be. Well, what if you have the interpretation of the 9th Circuit is that it's Saturday, and the 11th Circuit, it's Sunday? What does that mean for your law? So you're going to have those issues. One suggestion was something called Skidmore deference, which isn't actually deference at all, but is like basically a principle that says the first person kind of gets it. So let's say you're an administration and you pass the Clean Air Act and it set up the EPA and you set up the EPA and the EPA that you set up when you passed the Clean Air Act interpreted some words to mean something. And then 30 years later, some other administration comes in and their EPA says, you know what? We actually think those words mean the opposite of that. Well, under Skidmore deference, you would say, we are going to defer to the interpretation of the words by the agency closest in time to when the statute was passed, because they will have more expertise on what that was intended to mean. So that's one way to do it. And the problem with that is, I guess, depending on how you look at it, it's either a problem or not a problem. That is less flexible than Chevron, which can literally change 180 degrees every 4 years, depending on the election.
So one other thing to think about, and this will surely make it into the opinion, whatever way the court comes out. If Chevron deference is nixed by the Supreme Court, a major principle they're going to have to discuss, and that every single Supreme Court justice has been asked at confirmation, is the principle of stare decisis. I think we had a legal brief on stare decisis. So stare decisis is just the doctrine that courts are going to adhere to their previous precedent, right? There's been 40 years of this precedent. We've called some things super precedents, for example. If it's been around for a long time, cited millions of times, other doctrines have kind of built off of it, what that looks like. Now, it's just a principle. And obviously we've had Supreme Court cases that have overturned stare decisis, and this happens not infrequently. But then there is kind of the principle of when you adhere to precedents and when you decide to overturn it, and does it matter if it's super precedents or not. These are all very interesting principles. This is not an easy issue. The reason it's before the Supreme Court is because it is a very hairy issue, and we are bringing up all these different points so that when the court rules or you go listen to the arguments, you're able to hopefully make sense of these arguments. Because though this may seem very high level, Chevron deference of all the Supreme Court cases we've talked about on legal briefs probably affects your life the most, and you just may not know it. Because your life is dictated by countless regulations you may not even know exist. Much more than probably laws, to be honest. And so it touches every American's life, much more than, I don't know, Brady violations or even Giglio, unless that you're actually in court. And so that's why we decided to talk about this, because the administrative state and Chevron actually touches every one of our lives who live in this country. And having a basic understanding of it, I think, is incredibly important. And you're free to think about it however you'd like to. And we're going to find out what the Supreme Court is going to do very soon. And it's going to have major implications. I think either way it's going to have major implications because so many questions are raised. I also cannot see a world where they do not overturn Chevron. But if they do not, they're going to have to write. Something's going to have to change, right? All the problems we've talked about are brought up and they're on the justice's mind. And like I said, the center cannot hold. Something needs to be done. So this is going to create a shift in the law, and it will not be the end. There will be a lot more litigation after it. There will be a lot more changes depending on how the opinion is written, and it will affect our lives. You just may not see it, but now you hopefully will. Now that you know what regulations are and you take a step back, you may be able to see it in your personal lives as well as in your, business lives, professional lives, even the way you go shop at stores and, what sorts of regulations the stores you shop at are required to comply with.
Yeah, I mean, there's no part of your life this doesn't touch. And in some ways, as Alice said, it's more important. It's in many ways, it's more important who is sort of holding the levers of various administrative agencies than it is who controls Congress, who's in the Senate. In some ways, more important than who's in the courts, what judges. Obviously, the president's important because he's the one who decides who controls the levers. But, I mean, remember, it's not like the president is hanging out in the wildlife and fisheries office, chatting up the guy that runs that place, telling him exactly what he wants to do. I mean, the power that is sort of diffuse through these administrative agencies is incredible. And, and it's not so much whether you think it's a good idea or a bad idea. You may think it's great. They're going to ban menthol cigarettes. That's great. Menthol cigarettes are bad and it kills people. But it wasn't Congress who decided that, right? And you may think it's great that we have, energy efficient washers and dryers that, yes, I have to wash my dishes 3 times, but at least it uses half as much water each time I do it, which doesn't work out when you do the math. But nevertheless, stuff like that. Well, that's all set by these regulations, which are all promulgated through this process, which then become basically, would be lawsuit proof if anybody was applying Chevron. I think the problem with Chevron is it's already been abandoned. Courts essentially don't use it anymore. They've kind of moved on from it. And I think that's one reason the Supreme Court's going to move on from it, because I think they need to come up with, and I don't know how they're going to do it, they need to come up with something to replace it with that both allows the flexibility that they want, allows Congress to delegate to a certain extent its authority. Because if you delegate too much, you get into the non-delegation doctrine, which is another legal breeze. But that allows all this because really...
This is so law-heavy.
I know.
This is so law-heavy.
This is a very law-heavy episode. I'm sorry. But really, it's difficult to imagine a modern state that did not have the administrative component. A lot of people hate the administrative state, but, it's never going to be like when Lincoln was president and people would just wander into the White House with a problem and tell him like, hey, the postman down in Alexandria didn't get me my mail on time. Can you do something about that? It's never going to be like that again. So you have to figure out some sort of balance here where you have both political accountability, efficiency, and reviewability, because this does affect so many people and so many people's rights. And it's not really what we want, I don't think, and not what was envisioned when we started the country, that it would be mostly sort of unelected, unaccountable, not political, just permanent people hanging out on the, in an agency, making all these decisions that have these huge effects on your lives.
I mean, I'll go one step further. I don't think this was what the court envisioned in 1986 when it was passed. I think it has morphed into something well beyond. I think they could have foreseen some of it, but I think it has also morphed into something that is a logical end, by the way, of the decision of what it became. And
definitely, because they were looking, like you said, they were trying to return power to the people, right? I mean, that was the idea. We want to take power away from these unelected bureaucrats that we call judges. We want to take power away from them, and we want to put it back in the politically accountable branches, back to the legislature, back to the president. But it didn't work out that way because it just devolved down to another bunch of unelected, unaccountable bureaucrats. And in some ways, it became even worse because at least when the courts were doing it, there was a little bit more predictability. And now the only predictability is it's constantly going to change. Good luck to whoever has to come up with the rule.
I truthfully, after, being in a deposition all day and looking at our notes, I was like, we'll get this done in 25 minutes. I don't know why after all these years, I still think that we can be short-winded.
Well, this one, I mean, you could talk about this for...
This, I know. You could talk about Chevron deference. We've just begun to touch up. We haven't talked about the...
We got to do Humphrey's executive
APA.
At some point.
Humphrey's executive. We haven't talked about, unitary executive.
Independent
we haven't
agencies.
Talked about impeaching different impeachment process for not just the president. We're talking about cabinet members. Whew, there's a lot.
Then you had the congressional vetoes, those cases.
Yes.
Yeah, there's a lot. But
there is a lot. You know what I received in the mail today?
What is that?
From I don't know. It was, I think I was about to throw it away and I felt the package and it was I honestly cannot even remember. It was probably some nonprofit and I felt it and I was like, oh, I know what's in here. It was a little pocket Constitution. And I was like, man, if more people just read the Constitution, no, then you probably have to go read a con law book as well. Anyways, thank you guys. I know this was very dense, but I do think this is incredibly important because Chevron deference is not something I think you learn outside of law school. But again, it's something that touches all of us. While you are going to hear, if this case comes out like we think it's going to be, you're going to see a bunch of headlines that are the sky's falling. And hopefully this gives you some background to understand that the sky is not falling. It's going to be a shift for sure. But I think when you hear all the reasons for it, it's a really interesting conversation about what we want out of our democracy and how we want to be governed and by whom, and stability. And knowing, we talk about this in the criminal law all the time, why there's this doctrine against backward application of a criminal law, right? Like today it is not illegal to drive a red car, but tomorrow I pass a law that says anyone who drives a red car can be thrown in jail for a year. You would not want that to apply retroactively because that's unfair. You didn't know what the law was. I mean, that's the same kind of principle we're talking about here in terms of having stability and knowing what the laws and regulations are. Well, Brett, this was a light subject, so I'm really glad all of you stuck along with us. I really do think this is incredibly important, and I think it's an area that most people don't know much about. We are going to hear a lot about it in the next month when Loper Bright is decided. So hopefully you can revisit this whenever that decision comes out to understand, what's going on in that opinion.
And I think whatever happens, it's not the end of the world. The sky's not falling. Everything's going to be fine. Whatever replaces it will be fine.
This is why we're great co-hosts. I literally said that when you were gone.
Oh, did you? There you go. Yeah.
No, that's actually perfect because you weren't here to hear it. I said that no matter what, people are going to say the sky is falling when the decision comes out, whichever way it comes out.
Yeah, there's going to be a lot of really mad people either way.
And it's not.
If Chevron survives, Chevron delenda est. I mean, it won't be good. But if it goes down, same thing. And we'll just have to see what happens, but it won't be the end of the world.
Wow, this has been very engaging for me. I hope you've learned something today. If you have any additional questions, which who doesn't have questions about Chevron and all of the things that go along with it, please feel free to reach out to us at prosecutorspod@gmail.com or on social media, Instagram, Facebook, X, Twitter, TikTok, @prosecutorspod. We love hearing from you, and we also love hearing what you want to hear about. So tell us what you want to hear about on the next Legal Briefs. And don't forget, leave a 5-star review. You get to ask a question that we will answer.
We should definitely do a Chevron TikTok. Chevron in 60 seconds.
We should win like a Grammy for that if we can do it in 60 seconds. Well, until next time, I'm Alice.
And I'm Brett.
And this is the Prosecutor's Legal Briefs.
If you count up, you could just go
when
forever.
Your brain's just literally utter mush.
Don't forget, we got to do
right.
ads.
Start recording on 99. I'm just kidding. The crazy look because I've been in a deposition for 11 and a half hours.
It's too long.
Okay, but you know what? I made those enchiladas. Thanks, Sophie, for that great idea. They were a hit. I was able to make them the night before so that I could, have them ready for dinner
Nice.
on a moment's notice.